This video takes place in northern Idaho in February of 2024. Do you believe in Bigfoot? This guy has great pics of Bigfoot. This is a must-see.
I never believed in any of that stuff before. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I thought it was all nonsense. Just stories people made up for attention or to sell books. But after what happened to me last winter in the mountains of northern Idaho, I can't deny what I saw anymore. I'm sharing this because I need people to know the truth, even if they think I'm crazy. It was February 2024, and I'd been planning this solo hiking trip for months. I'm an experienced hiker, been doing it for over 15 years, and I wanted to challenge myself with a winter trek through some of the most remote wilderness in the country. The area I chose was about 60 miles northeast of Coeur d'Alene, deep in the Selkirk Mountains. It's the kind of place where you can hike for days without seeing another soul. I packed enough supplies for a week, loaded up my truck, and drove the winding forest roads until they became impassable. From there, I strapped on my snowshoes and started the long trek into the backcountry. The plan was simple: hike about 20 miles in, set up a base camp, and spend a few days exploring the area before heading back. The first day went perfectly. The weather was crisp, but not brutal, maybe around 15 degrees with clear skies. The snow was deep, at least 3 feet in most places, but my snowshoes handled it fine. I made good time and found a decent spot to camp near a frozen creek. That first night, I fell asleep to the sound of wind through the pine trees and the occasional crack of ice settling. It was
Generate
peaceful.
by AI.
The second morning started normal enough. I broke camp early and decided to explore a ridge that looked promising from my map. The terrain was challenging but manageable, and I was feeling good about the hike. That's when I found the first footprint. I was crossing a small clearing when I noticed it in the snow about 20 yards ahead. At first, I thought it might be from a moose or elk, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The print was huge.
I would have turned around after seeing these.
But it wasn't shaped like any animal track I'd ever seen. It looked almost human, but way too big. The toes were clearly defined, and you could see where whatever made it had pressed deep into the snow. I stood there staring at it for probably 10 minutes, trying to rationalize what I was looking at. Maybe it was an old track that had melted and refrozen, making it look bigger than it really was. Maybe someone was out here wearing some kind of weird snowshoes. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. On the third day, I started noticing other things. Tree branches broken off at heights that didn't make sense. 10, 12 feet up, snapped clean through. These weren't old breaks from storms or fallen trees. The wood was fresh, and the way they were twisted suggested something incredibly strong had grabbed them and torn them apart. I found scratches on tree trunks too, deep gouges in the bark, way higher than any bear could reach, and bears should have been hibernating anyway. These marks looked deliberate, like something had been marking territory. The scratches were always in sets of 4 or 5 parallel lines, and they cut deep enough to reach the white wood underneath. That night, I made camp in a small grove of pine trees that felt more sheltered than my previous spots. I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy about being out there alone. As I was setting up my tent, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it went on too long and had too much variation to be weather. Then it changed into something that sounded almost like a howl, but deeper and more guttural than any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. The fourth day brought the discovery that really shook me up. I was following what looked like a game trail when I noticed a dark opening in a rocky outcrop about a quarter-mile ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was the entrance to a cave. Not huge, but big enough for a person to walk into without ducking. I probably should have turned around right then, but curiosity got the better of me and I decided to take a quick look inside. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped through the entrance. The smell hit me immediately. It was rank, like wet fur mixed with rotting meat and something else I couldn't identify. The kind of smell that makes you want to cover your nose and back away. But I forced myself to take a few more steps in. The cave went back further than I expected, maybe 40 feet before curving out of sight. The floor was covered with a layer of pine needles and what looked like animal bones. Deer mostly, but some I couldn't identify. In one corner there was a pile of what looked like bedding material. Branches, moss, and chunks of bark all matted together into something resembling a nest. But what really got my attention were the scratch marks on the walls. They were everywhere, carved deep into the rock. Some looked random, but others seemed almost intentional, like primitive drawings or symbols. And they were all at heights that made no sense for any normal animal. What disturbed me even more was finding what looked like partially chewed bones scattered around the nest area. Some still had meat clinging to them, and the bite marks were unlike anything I'd seen before. Too big for a wolf, too precise for a bear. The teeth that had made these marks were enormous and arranged in a pattern that seemed almost human-like. I was examining one of the larger bones when I heard something that made my blood freeze. From deeper in the cave, beyond where my flashlight could reach, came a low breathing sound. Deep, rhythmic, like something large was sleeping back there in the darkness. I backed toward the entrance, trying not to make any noise, when I heard rocks shifting outside. My heart hammered as I clicked off my flashlight and pressed myself against the cave wall. Through the entrance, I could see a large shadow moving across the snow. Whatever it was huge and walking upright. The breathing from the back of the cave had stopped. Whatever was deeper in there had woken up, and I could hear it moving around in the darkness. I was trapped between something outside and something behind me, both of which sounded far too large to be anything I wanted to encounter. I held my breath and waited. The shadow paused right outside the cave entrance for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, it moved away. I stayed pressed against that wall for another 10 minutes, listening to occasional sounds from the depths of the cave, before I worked up the courage to look outside. The area was empty, but there were fresh tracks in the snow, the same massive footprints I'd been finding, but these were right outside the cave. Whatever had made them had been standing just feet away from where I was hiding. Barely slept. Every sound outside my tent sent adrenaline shooting through my system. The wind moving through branches sounded like footsteps. Settling snow sounded like breathing. I kept my flashlight ready and my bear spray within reach, though I was starting to doubt either would be much help against whatever was out there. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made me sit bolt upright in my sleeping bag. It was the sound of my campsite being investigated. Something was moving around outside my tent, circling it slowly. I could hear the soft crunch of snow with each step, and occasionally the sound of my gear being moved or sniffed. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent wall near my head. I held my breath and listened. For at least 5 minutes, whatever was out there just stood there. I could hear breathing. Deep, measured breaths that fogged in the cold air. At one point, I swear I felt pressure against the tent wall, like something was gently pushing against it to test its strength. Then came a sound that nearly made me scream. A low, rumbling vocalization, almost like purring, but much deeper and more guttural. It seemed to come from directly above my tent, as if whatever was making the sound was standing right over me, The sound went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I lay there in complete silence for the rest of the night, too terrified to move. When morning finally came, I found evidence that something had indeed been in my camp. My backpack had been moved several feet from where I'd left it. The snow around my tent was packed down with those massive footprints forming a complete circle. And strangest of all, someone or something had built a small cairn of rocks just 20 feet from my tent while I was sleeping inside. The fifth day, I decided to do some exploring closer to my campsite instead of venturing further into the wilderness. I figured if I stayed in a smaller area, I'd feel more in control of the situation. That turned out to be completely wrong. I was following the frozen creek when I started getting the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. You know that sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you just know someone's eyes are on you? It was like that, but magnified by 100. I kept turning around, scanning the tree line, but I never saw anything definitive. Just occasional movements in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Shadows that seemed to shift when they should have been still. The feeling of being stalked by something that was much better at hiding than I was at spotting it. Around midday, I stopped to eat lunch on a fallen log near the creek. That's when I heard the wood knocking for the first time. It started as 3 sharp raps, like someone hitting a tree with a large stick. The sound echoed through the forest, and after a few seconds, it was answered by similar knocking from a different direction. The pattern continued for several minutes. 3 knocks from one location, answered by 3 knocks from somewhere else. It was clearly some kind of communication, and the locations were moving. Whatever was making the sounds was coordinating, possibly surrounding me. The knocking gradually got closer until it seemed to be coming from just beyond the tree line on both sides of the creek. Then it stopped. The forest went completely silent in a way that felt unnatural. No wind, no bird calls, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just dead silence that seemed to press in on me from all directions. I packed up my lunch as quickly as possible and started moving. But the feeling of being watched intensified. Every few minutes, I'd hear a single knock from somewhere behind me, as if whatever was following me was marking my position for something else. When I found the deer carcass, everything started to make sense in the worst possible way. I was crossing a small clearing when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. On the opposite bank, maybe 50 yards downstream, there was a structure that definitely wasn't natural. Someone, or something, had stacked logs and branches against a large boulder, creating what looked like a crude shelter. The construction was rough but effective, and it was clearly recent. But it wasn't the shelter that made my stomach drop. It was what was hanging from a tree branch next to it. A deer carcass was suspended about 8 feet off the ground, hung by what looked like twisted vines or strips of bark. The animal had been gutted and partially skinned, but not in any way I'd ever seen a hunter dress a kill. The cuts were jagged and uneven, as if it had been torn apart by hand rather than cut with a knife. What made it even more disturbing was how fresh it was. Blood was still dripping from the carcass into the snow below, which meant this kill had happened recently. Very recently, maybe within the last few hours. I crossed the creek to get a better look, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. Up close, the shelter was even more impressive. The logs were huge, the kind that would take several people working together to move. But there were no tool marks, no evidence of ropes or machinery. It looked like everything had been placed by brute strength alone. Inside the shelter, I found more of those bone piles and the same rank smell from the cave. There were also chunks of bark that had been stripped from trees and arranged like primitive bedding. But what really disturbed me were the claw marks on the inside walls of the shelter. Deep gouges in the wood that looked like they'd been made by fingernails, except no human fingernails were that thick or that strong. That's when I realized the wood knocking had started again, but this time it was much closer, and it wasn't coming from just 2 locations anymore. I could hear it from at least 4 different directions, forming a rough circle around my position. I was being surrounded. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures of the shelter, moving as quickly as possible. But as I was snapping photos, I heard something that made me freeze. The sound of heavy footsteps crunching through snow, getting closer from multiple directions. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a series of low vocalizations that sounded almost like whispered conversations. I couldn't make out any words, but the rhythm and cadence suggested complex communication. Whatever was out there, they were talking to each other about me. I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. There was a cluster of large pine trees about 20 yards away that might provide cover, but getting there would mean crossing open ground where I'd be completely exposed. The alternative was to stay near the shelter and hope whatever was coming would lose interest. Then I saw movement through the trees on the far side of the clearing. Something large and dark was moving toward me, still mostly hidden by the forest, but getting closer with each second. The way it moved was wrong, too fluid, too confident, like a predator that knew it had cornered its prey. I made the decision to run for the trees. It was probably the only thing that saved my life. I bolted across the clearing, expecting at any moment to hear those footsteps behind me getting closer. But instead of pursuit, I heard something even more terrifying. Laughter. Deep, rumbling sounds that might have been amusement. Whatever was out there was letting me run because it found my panic entertaining. I pressed myself behind the largest pine tree and tried to control my breathing. Through a gap in the branches, I could see the clearing and the shelter I'd just fled. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then they appeared. 3 of them. 3 massive figures emerged from different points around the clearing, moving with the coordinated precision of a hunting pack. They were all similar to what I'd glimpsed before. 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, walking upright but with a gait that was distinctly non-human. But seeing multiple creatures at once drove home just how intelligent and organized they were. The largest one, which I assumed was the leader, approached the shelter and began examining the area where I'd been standing. It moved with purpose, clearly following my scent trail. The other 2 positioned themselves at opposite sides of the clearing, effectively cutting off any escape routes. What terrified me most was how methodical they were. This wasn't random behavior or simple animal curiosity. They were hunting me, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The leader made a series of clicking sounds, and the other 2 began moving in my direction. They hadn't spotted me yet, but they knew approximately where I was hiding. It was like watching a search and rescue operation, except I was the one who needed rescuing from the rescuers. I realized I had maybe 30 seconds before they found me. The trees I was hiding behind wouldn't provide cover for long, and there was nowhere to run that wouldn't put me in the open. But I still had my camera, and some part of my brain realized this might be the only chance anyone would ever have to document these creatures. My hands were shaking as I raised the camera and managed to take 1 photograph through the gap in the branches. The largest creature was in perfect profile, clearly visible about 60 yards away. Even through the viewfinder, its size was intimidating. But as soon as the camera's shutter clicked, all 3 creatures stopped moving and turned toward my position. For a moment, the entire forest seemed frozen. Then the leader let out a vocalization that was unlike anything I'd heard before, a mix of roar and scream that seemed to go right through me. They had found me. What happened next was like something out of a nightmare. The 3 creatures didn't just run toward me, they coordinated their approach like experienced hunters. One came straight at me while the other 2 circled around to cut off my flanks. I had maybe a 5-second head start before they reached my position. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through snow and underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear them gaining ground with each step. The sounds they made while chasing me were the most terrifying part. It wasn't just the heavy footfalls or the breaking of branches. They were communicating with each other, coordinating their pursuit with a series of calls and responses that sounded almost like a language. I made it maybe 200 yards before I realized I wasn't going to outrun them. My lungs were burning from the cold air, and the deep snow was slowing me down while they seemed to move through it effortlessly. I could hear them getting closer, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they caught me. That's when I spotted the narrow ravine ahead. It was maybe 4 feet wide and looked like it cut deep into the hillside. If I could make it there, the confined space might level the playing field. At least they wouldn't be able to surround me. I changed direction and dove for the ravine just as something massive crashed through the bushes behind me. I felt claws rake across my backpack as I tumbled down the rocky slope, tearing the fabric but missing my body by inches. The ravine was deeper than I'd expected, maybe 15 feet down to a narrow stream bed. I landed hard on the rocky bottom, jarring my shoulder and scraping my hands, but I was alive and temporarily out of reach. Above me, I could hear the creatures moving around the rim of the ravine, looking for a way down. The largest one appeared at the edge directly above me, and for the first time, I got a clear look at its face. It was definitely not human, but it wasn't purely animal either. The features were ape-like, but more refined, more intelligent. The eyes especially seemed to show awareness and problem-solving ability. It was studying the ravine, trying to figure out how to get down to me without getting trapped itself. After a few minutes, the creatures moved away from the ravine edge, but I could still hear them in the forest above. They hadn't given up. They were regrouping and planning their next move. The stream bed led deeper into the hillside toward what looked like a more substantial canyon system. If I could follow it far enough, I might be able to find another way out, or at least put more distance between me and my pursuers. But as I started moving downstream, I heard something that made me stop cold. From somewhere ahead of me, echoing off the canyon walls, came an answering call to the vocalizations I'd been hearing from above. There were more of them, and they were between me and any possible escape route. I was completely surrounded in a ravine with nowhere to run. I was trapped in that ravine for over an hour, listening to the creatures moving around above me and hearing calls from others somewhere downstream. They were patient, methodical, clearly more intelligent than any animal I'd ever encountered. But they also seemed to be waiting for something. That's when I realized what was happening. It was getting dark. During the day, I'd had the advantage of visibility and the ability to see them coming. But as night fell, that advantage would disappear completely. They knew the terrain better than I did, could move more quietly, and probably had much better night vision. They were waiting for darkness to finish what they'd started. I had to make a move while I still had some daylight left. The ravine walls were steep, but not impossible to climb. About 50 yards upstream from where I'd fallen, there was a section where erosion had created a more gradual slope. If I could reach it without being seen, I might be able to climb out on the opposite side from where most of the creatures seemed to be positioned. Moving as quietly as possible, I worked my way upstream along the rocky bottom. Every few steps, I'd pause and listen for movement above, but the forest had gone eerily quiet. That worried me more than the vocalizations had. When predators go silent, it usually means they're preparing to strike. I was almost to the climbing spot when I heard something that made my blood freeze. From directly above me came the sound of breathing, slow and measured. One of them had been following my progress along the rim of the ravine, staying directly overhead as I moved. I looked up and saw a massive silhouette against the darkening sky. It was crouched at the edge of the ravine, watching me. When our eyes met, it made a soft clicking sound, almost like it was amused by my attempted escape. That's when I heard answering clicks from multiple directions. They had all been tracking me, waiting to see what I would do. I was like a mouse in a maze, and they were the cats watching every move I made. The creature above me stood up to its full height and let out a long, complex vocalization that echoed through the canyon. It was clearly some kind of signal, because immediately I heard movement from all directions as the pack began to converge on my position. I didn't have time to be careful anymore. I scrambled up the slope as fast as I could, slipping on loose rocks and scraping my hands raw on the stone. Behind me, I could hear something large dropping down into the ravine. I made it to the top just as powerful hands grabbed at my ankles. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was caught, but my boots slipped off in the creature's grip and I tumbled forward into the underbrush. What followed was the most intense chase of my life. The creatures were no longer being subtle or methodical. They crashed through the forest behind me with single-minded purpose, and I could hear at least 4 of them now, maybe more. I ran blindly through the darkening woods, branches whipping across my face, roots catching my feet. My lungs burned from the cold air and exertion, but terror kept me moving. Every time I thought I might be gaining some distance, I'd hear that coordinated calling behind me, and I knew they were still coming. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw something ahead that gave me hope. The entrance to another cave system, this one much smaller than the ones I'd explored before. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I dove for the entrance just as something massive crashed through the trees behind me. Claws raked across my backpack again, this time tearing it completely off my back. But I managed to squeeze through the opening and tumble into the darkness beyond. The space inside was cramped, more of a crevice than a true cave. I had to crawl on my hands and knees to move deeper into it, but that was exactly what I needed. Nothing as large as those creatures would be able to follow me. Behind me, I could hear them trying to get through the entrance. The sounds of claws scraping against rock, frustrated vocalizations, and what sounded like attempts to dig or widen the opening. But the passage was too narrow, and eventually the sounds stopped. I crawled as far back into the crevice as I could and settled in to wait. I had no idea how long they would stay outside, but I knew I couldn't leave until I was absolutely certain they were gone. What followed were the longest, most terrifying hours of my life. The creatures didn't leave. Instead, they took turns keeping watch outside the cave entrance. I could hear them moving around, sometimes right outside the opening, sometimes further away, but always close enough that I knew escape was impossible. They tried different approaches to get me out. At first, there was the direct assault, attempts to claw or dig their way through the rock. When that failed, they tried what I can only describe as psychological warfare. They would make sounds designed to mimic human voices, calling out things like, "Help me," and "Is anyone there?" in voices that were almost convincing but not quite right. The cadence was off, the pronunciation slightly wrong, like they had learned the words by listening to humans but didn't understand what they meant. Other times they would bang rocks against the cave entrance in complex rhythms, creating patterns that seemed almost musical. I realized they were trying to communicate, possibly attempting to negotiate or trick me into coming out. The most disturbing moments were when they went completely silent. During those periods, I couldn't tell if they had finally left or if they were just waiting patiently outside. The uncertainty was almost worse than the active threats. Around what I guessed was midnight, something changed. The sounds outside became more agitated, with rapid vocalizations between multiple creatures. It sounded like they were arguing or debating something. Then I heard new sounds, the breaking of branches and what sounded like rocks being thrown. They were destroying my campsite. I could hear them tearing apart everything I'd left behind, probably searching for more information about me or just expressing their frustration. The sounds went on for over an hour before things finally went quiet again. I forced myself to wait until I could see daylight filtering through the cave entrance before I even considered leaving. Even then, I spent another hour listening for any signs of movement outside. When I finally worked up the courage to crawl back toward the entrance, I discovered they had left me a message. Arranged in a neat line just outside the cave opening were pieces of my destroyed equipment, my torn backpack, my shredded sleeping bag, my bent tent poles. It was clearly intentional, a demonstration of what they could have done to me if they had gotten their hands on me. But mixed in with the wreckage was something that chilled me to the bone. My camera. It was sitting upright in the snow, completely undamaged despite the destruction around it. They had found it in my backpack and deliberately left it intact. I realized they wanted me to have the photographs I'd taken. They wanted proof of their existence to survive, even if I didn't. The implications of that level of intelligence and planning were terrifying. The moment the camera's shutter clicked, everything changed. The creature's head snapped toward my position, and its posture shifted from curious to aggressive in an instant. It let out a roar that was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part scream, part howl, and completely terrifying. I managed to take one more quick photo as it started charging toward me. Then survival instinct kicked in and I ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. The snow that had slowed me down all week suddenly felt like quicksand as I tried to get away from whatever was behind me. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every step. I made it maybe 50 yards before something slammed into my back and sent me flying face first into the snow. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I couldn't move or breathe. Then massive hands grabbed me and flipped me over. The creature was right on top of me, its face inches from mine. The smell was overwhelming, rank breath and wet fur and something wild and predatory. Its eyes were filled with what I can only describe as rage. It opened its mouth and let out another roar that was so loud and close it made my ears ring. Then it grabbed my left shoulder and squeezed. I felt something pop, and pain shot down my entire arm. I screamed and tried to push it away, but it was like trying to move a mountain. The creature was impossibly strong. It raised one massive hand above my head, and I thought that was it. I was going to die in the middle of nowhere, killed by something that wasn't supposed to exist. But instead of finishing me off, the creature suddenly looked up and around as if it had heard something. Then it released me and backed away. I don't know why it didn't kill me. Maybe it heard another sound that distracted it, or maybe it just lost interest. All I know is that after staring at me for another few seconds, it turned and walked back toward its cave. I lay in the snow for several minutes, too shocked and hurt to move. My left shoulder was definitely dislocated or broken, and I had cuts on my face from being thrown into the snow. But I was alive, and that was more than I'd expected a few minutes earlier. Very slowly, I managed to sit up and look around. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear sounds coming from the direction of its cave. I needed to get out of there before it decided to come back and finish what it had started. That's when I noticed the narrow opening in the rock face about 10 yards to my left. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it looked like it went back into the mountain. If the creature came back, it might be the only place I could hide. Moving as quietly as possible, I crawled toward the opening. My left arm was useless, so I had to pull myself along with just my right hand. Every movement sent waves of pain through my shoulder, but I forced myself to keep going. The opening was even tighter than it looked. I had to remove my backpack and push it ahead of me to get through. But once I was inside, the space opened up into a narrow tunnel that went back about 15 feet before ending in a small chamber. I pulled my backpack in after me and settled in to wait. The tunnel was so narrow that nothing as large as the creature I'd encountered would be able to follow me. At least I hoped it wouldn't be able to. The next 12 hours were the longest of my life. I could hear the creature moving around outside, sometimes very close to my hiding spot. Several times, I heard it breathing or making those strange vocalizations right outside the tunnel entrance. Once, I swear I heard it trying to dig or scratch at the rocks around the opening. I didn't dare use my flashlight or make any sound. I just sat in complete darkness, listening and praying that the creature wouldn't find a way to get to me. My shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, and I was starting to worry about hypothermia. But I was too terrified to even think about leaving my hiding spot. Around what I guessed was midnight, the sounds outside finally stopped, but I still didn't move. I forced myself to wait until I could see daylight filtering through the tunnel entrance before I even considered leaving. When morning finally came, I listened carefully for any signs that the creature was still in the area. After hearing nothing for over an hour, I slowly worked my way back through the tunnel. The area outside looked like a war zone. Snow was scattered everywhere, trees were broken, and there were massive footprints all around the entrance to my hiding spot. The creature had definitely been trying to get to me. I gathered my courage and made my way back to where I'd been attacked. My camera was lying in the snow where I'd dropped it, but amazingly it was still intact. The LCD screen was cracked, but when I turned it on, it still worked. Looking at the images I'd captured was surreal. There it was, clear as day, a massive, hair-covered creature that shouldn't exist. The first photo showed it in profile near the creek. The second, taken right before the attack, showed it facing directly toward the camera with what could only be described as an expression of fury. I wanted to take more pictures of the area, to document the cave and the evidence of the creature's presence. But I knew I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. If it came back while I was still in the area, I might not be so lucky a second time. The hike out was a nightmare. My shoulder was definitely broken, and I could only use one arm. The snow that had been manageable on the way in was now a serious obstacle. Several times I fell and had to struggle to get back up.
The man went to the ER immediately. After some time he finally got the nerve up to tell some people about the occurrence he had. Of course, some people believed him and some people didn't. I don't see how he could make up all his pics. I do believe we are always coming across animals that are a new finding.